In my previous video, we saw how human cultures have cycles of genes and memes or ideas. What this means is humans can innovate new patterns of behaviour, or at least around 1 in 10 of us with leadership skills can do that, and then they can create traditions or cultures around those ideas, which the rest of us, the followers, can then take up. This makes humans very adaptable. And they can pass on these ideas through our unique gift of language. And then we also saw what a good meme is, and how such good ideas stand the test of time and then should be preserved to allow the spiritual flourishing of a community. We also saw how certain bad memes seek to innovate, but outside of the group, so pursuing self-interest to the detriment of the group, promoting an untenable hyper-individualism which leads to the collapse of civilizations. We see this today in the liberationist views of the current liberal paradigm. The endless quest to liberate the ego from all natural constraints, whether that be the natural order of the group or even one's own body and biology in some quasi-Gnostic fashion. Now, the question we're dealing with in this video is, how would a Christian polity police its memes and protect good memes more specifically, and on what grounds? We live in a time, of course, where AI has started using large language model software, like ChatGPT, which is quite popular at the moment, allowing liberal ideologues to skew the public discourse and to serve particular narratives. What the reign of liberalism has taught us is that the public discourse is going to be policed, whether we like it or not. Even in our individualistic, liberal society, which claims to uphold free speech, it too must quash speech which it finds heretical. For liberalism, there are no public creeds, of course, but the trouble is that this statement in itself, that there are no public creeds, becomes a public creed in itself. And so, majority groups, whether they be native populations or historically majority religions within a given territory, these pose a threat to liberalism because they present the possibility of a consensus, the threat that a public creed might arise which could threaten individual liberty. So, inevitably, majority groups are going to be targeted by the state. Yet, in a self-contradiction, liberalism provides no philosophical basis to justify any of this. Being based in a naturalistic worldview without any objective right or wrong, nevertheless, no law can operate without some vision of the good to which it is ordered. And therefore, even in our open society, chaos literally becomes the order of the day, as greater and greater pluralism and diversity are pursued, perceived as an end in themselves. So, to protect good memes and to police bad ideas, any sustainable polity needs to have not only a shared conception of objective good and bad, but also of justice and other virtues. For this reason, many great minds, some of whom we will mention in this video, propose a return to the classical understanding of justice. In opposition to the worst excesses of liberalism, various forms of Christian nationalism are currently on the rise in Western countries. There is an intuitive understanding that the West has lost its spiritual community, i.e. Christendom, and has therefore lost the philosophical basis for its classical virtues. Without this solid grounding, we cannot clearly define what justice objectively is, nor the common good that it's supposed to uphold. Nor can we protect those ideas which lead to the spiritual health of the community by thwarting those heresies and crimes which would destroy it. So, let's now define justice, the common good, and propose a system of defending the public discourse on Christian and Platonist grounds.
Rome is civilization! Rome is order! Rome is power! And out here, we are Rome!
So, what is justice? Justice is, of course, one of the 4 classical or cardinal virtues of the ancient world. Conjures up the thoughts of figures like Plato and Aristotle. It's the virtue specifically of establishing right relationships with others so that a polity, or smaller groups, even like the family even, can come into existence and be sustained. According to St. Thomas Aquinas, general legal justice is the perpetual and constant will to render to each one his due, or jus, for the common good of that political community. And this is, of course, the Catholic view. It is the traditional Christian view. Indeed, it is just the classical view of what justice is. And it's important to understand that it really does presuppose a corporatist understanding, an organic view of communities and societies. So the polity is really a body politic, and it is something in and of itself. It kind of forms a new organism, which, if you view some of the earlier videos in this series, you will see that these body politics, they really do behave like an independent organism. And there's so much data for that, even recent data. It's not just some quaint ancient view that we get from Plato or Hinduism or something like that. Okay, so everybody must be given their due. And that achieves the common good. What exactly is the common good? There's a lot of confusion about this. As a starting point, it might be easy to think of a public good in economics. This is considered something which is non-rivalrous, so people are not squabbling over ownership of this thing. They can't. It's something that cannot be depleted. And it's something which nobody in the group can be excluded from. So think of a beautiful landscape or a beautiful monument, for instance, or arguably even a beautiful cathedral, something like that. If we want a strictly traditional Catholic definition of the common good, it is those conditions of the social life whereby men, families and associations more adequately and readily may attain their own perfection. So basically this is those organic communities. This is their spiritual health. So it's not simply about individuals within the group attaining to virtue or approximating their best selves. Within a traditional Christian understanding, this is also making sure people get to heaven, basically, within the group. But it's more than that. Please don't confuse this with, the common good is just the sum of all the individuals' happiness within that, or it's the sum of their private goods within that community. The common good is basically just the objective principles by which the body politic as a whole, as a unitary thing, how its good is achieved, is a little bit difficult for us in our modern mindset to try and understand things in this non-individualistic kind of way. But just go with it, and I promise everything will fit into place. So examples of common goods are things like truth, justice in the political community. A nice example that's frequently used is friendship, of course, but also consider like a sports team and their victory and how they share that. That is a common good. And you might describe it as being that team, Manchester United or whatever, or like some American baseball team like the Red Sox or something. They have achieved a victory. Now, of course, you might think of the individual happiness of the individual members within that team, but the way we talk about it and the way that we colloquially, just think about it is that team, including all the supporters and everything, like as a community, like as an individual entity itself, has achieved victory. And that is a common good for that thing. And so to reiterate, it's things which enable and encourage us, not just as individuals, but as an organic whole, to grow in virtue and faith, and ultimately to be united with God. Now, a really well-developed framework for understanding our needs and how our needs are met is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you're not familiar with this, you should be. It's very well known. It's popular and good. It's something good to get to grips with. Now, Maslow extended this, so the one that you're seeing on the screen right now is his later work, basically, and a much fuller understanding of what he's talking about. A much earlier way of understanding what the common good was is Botero's reason of the state, and so he defines the common good with this triptych of peace, justice, and abundance. Now, obviously, since Botero was around centuries ago, things have developed quite a bit. And I think Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a really good way for us to get to grips with what the common good looks like. So, okay, we have our basic political and economic security at the bottom. We've got physiological needs, like, you need to have food and water to survive. So assuming you haven't starved to death, we can then move on to safety and security. So we might think of this as being more in a political sense then. When you're a baby, an infant, a child, obviously this would probably come from your family structure that you're born into. But, we can also think of it in political terms as well. Think about the polity, the broader system at play there, where we, arguably there's some kind of national defence or something like that. Or you might think of even the security of your home to think of things a bit more immediately. Moving on to love and belonging, we're starting to get more into the social aspect of things here, rather than just like immediate physiological needs and, being kept safe from death. We're starting to think of things more in terms of family, friendship, kinship. Love. Hopefully, if you've got a good family structure, loving parents, you'll get something from that. And this really is a necessity. It really is a need. back in the day when those things were still acceptable, experiments were performed on monkeys to see how they would fare without physical contact and affection from their mothers. They were brain damaged, basically. They couldn't function. So it is important to think of love and affection as being human needs. In terms of belonging, you do need to feel a sense of belonging to a group, whether that's the family or, as you get older, that would probably be things outside of the family. Men really, feel a psychological need to belong to part of a group, to the honor group. As children are growing up, they are psychologically healthiest when they feel they belong to a family. And so there are organic groups and orders. Hopefully it extends out more than just your immediate family. And hopefully there are groups like this which exist in the society, which you can be a part of. And you can feel that you are at home. Because when you feel you are at home, then you feel that you can actually express yourself. You are psychologically healthy. And you feel safe, basically. So ideally, in a Christian polity, it would focus on nurturing and encouraging families, positively so. And when self-esteem, especially when we're a teenager and older, self-esteem comes from the kudos we get from outside of family, and especially, from people who don't feel an obligation to say nice things about us just because, we're their immediate family. But, they're offering respect and kudos to us for a job well done and things like that. This helps us to build confidence, and it helps us to build self-esteem. Now, before we move on, again, it's important to understand the political duty of a government within a Christian polity to uphold, so self-esteem, but there's also a political dimension to that. So we end up with the traditional Christian doctrine of subsidiarity, which is actually an ancient European principle, and we get it from the ancient Greeks as well, who were really into this stuff. So basically, decision-making should be as local to the people it affects as possible. And so this isn't necessarily like a right, like I have the right to make a decision about this. It's actually a duty, and you would be expected to uphold that duty. If a decision or a solution is too complicated for an individual or a family or a town or something like that, the decision or the solution can then be achieved by a larger political grouping. And so what this means is that individuals have duties. They have political duties, so they can really feel not just that they're a part of a group, so they have a sense of belonging, but also they have self-esteem. They are a part of the political process, and so this builds confidence, and it builds a sense of duty, and also a sense of solidarity within the group. Because ultimately solidarity is where you have shared loves and shared goals, particularly with civic projects. And so in a country like Switzerland, for instance, where townspeople are not just part of the political process, but also they have certain duties to do things for their own town, this encourages a sense of solidarity and community. And something important to note here is that solidarity and multiculturalism don't necessarily go hand in hand. Something which is arguably a pretty big misconception for the open society of Western liberalism today. In 2020, there was a study by Dinesen et al., and they basically did a literature review of 87 different major studies on multiculturalism, diversity, and the impacts that it had on social health, the trust in society, etc. In every single paper, it was shown that diversity and multiculturalism have a negative impact on all of these things, forcing us to conclude that multiculturalism and diversity as they exist currently do not have a healthy impact on the solidarity of a polity. So in terms of our sense of belonging and love and loyalty, it does simply seem that the natural affections that we have towards people to whom we are genetically related, not just in our family, but in our kin and in our country, our fellow countrymen, that is something that's important for solidarity, and we need to work with that, to work with natural affections, as Aristotle would argue, and not against natural affections. In terms of knowledge and understanding, again, there's a social dimension to this, so enabling others to grow and nurturing others and mentoring others, and having a polity which not just allows this but encourages this as a human need. Now, with most people who are interested in what a Christian polity should look like or would look like, particularly Catholic integralist types, they'll stop right there. They'll stop there with the things that we've just discussed. An example is Adrian Vermeulen, who's a legal scholar at Harvard in the United States, quite a notable one, and he outlines what he believes is the common good, some principles here: health, safety, economic security, solidarity, and subsidiarity. So basically up to the yellow bit, pretty much, what we've discussed so far. But they tend to refuse to touch on the fact that actually we also need to have a spiritual elite, the leaders in terms of the innovators of ideas in our society. They all need to be on the same page. So you need to have basically a predominant, privileged religion, or logos in the society, to which everyone kind of has to adhere, or at least cannot then be subverting or attacking. And so this is why the top three bits, which Maslow then later added to, with transcendence being at the very top, as well as a need for aesthetics, as well as a need for beauty, and all of the objective divine qualities that points to, and the psychological health that it gives to everyone in the community. So I'm basically going to define that now as like the spiritual security of a polity, where you have transcendence, you have God, basically, you have the ground of all being, of all philosophy and rationality, as well as those divine qualities of love, goodness, beauty, truth, which then give us a purpose outside of ourselves, as well as giving direction to the politics and purpose, a philanthropic purpose to the economics of the polity itself, of the body politic, not just for our individual selves and our individual lives. So basically, I think all of Maslow's hierarchy of needs very readily applies to our conception of the common good. And let me just clear up something here, because you might be tempted to think like, oh, transcendence is at the top, so that means it's the least important. Whereas physiological needs like, water, clean water, that's obviously the most immediately important thing. It's not just that, this has been disproven for individuals, because individuals might, for instance, go on a hunger strike and starve themselves to death for a principle that they really believe in, even a political principle. So it's not just that, but it's also that in order to make sure that the government of a polity is going in the right direction and then meeting all of these needs for the whole and for individual parts within. It's important maybe if we flip this thing upside down. And when we do that, I like to illustrate this as being like a glass of water. Bear with me on this. You see, to live within a polity which allows or even encourages one to lead the good life, as Aristotle would put it, that is a life of honour and virtue, doing good to one's neighbour and, upholding justice, rendering to each his due. That polity must have shared and defined metaphysical values. In short, it must have a religion. So think of this religion as being like the base of the glass, whereby there's an immovable grounding for the glass. It comes up against whatever is beyond the glass, and it provides a firm, flat starting point. And what's more, this base then provides direction for the shape of the glass. Basically, it provides direction for the government, which protects what is inside the glass and conversely keeps out whatever is outside of the glass, basically defending what is within the glass, and also giving shape to the contents of the glass. Think of this as whatever is within the territory of that polity. Now, without a defined base, the glass will of course wobble and err in different directions and ultimately lose its content. If any cracks are made, subverting any of this, likewise the security of the glass and its contents has been compromised. So with the spiritual security of the polity in mind, is universally unmitigated access to our public discourse a public good? Is free speech basically a public good? If we return back to what the idea of a bad meme, a bad idea is, where you are promoting your self-interest, but to the detriment of the group, we can start to think, okay, well, acting in one's self-interest is of course natural, but how do we police, heretics who want to distort the common good and breach the group's spiritual security to serve their own self-interests? If free speech allows for the subversion and the destruction of the base of the glass, how do you police something like that, especially in our technologically advanced information age? Well, it's important to understand that language is being policed in the West. It's going to be policed whether you want it to or not, even and especially in a liberal society. Right now, we have systems of discourse analysis, as it's formally called. That is the field of study in linguistics. And the framework for policing language basically is called intersectionality. You may have heard of this. And basically it's a way of identifying different minority categories within a jurisdiction. And because in the liberal system, it is afraid of majorities forming, whereas they might create a consensus and they might be a threat to the individual liberty of individuals or small groups. Liberalism does tend then to prefer and to privilege smaller groups, and so it will do so on a variety of different categories. And some of these can look a bit grotesque. I've chosen an image here which is not too complicated, and it just gives you a general idea of the sort of categories they're looking for in order to identify minority groups, which then within the liberal system they say are being discriminated against by those majorities who have privilege. And so this is where you get, for instance, the idea of white privilege. And so then in certain situations, in certain places, majority groups will then be specifically targeted and then disadvantaged because then they see this as being some sort of equity. And as I say, within linguistics, there is a whole field of study in analysing language to see whether it is racist or sexist or being hateful towards people of a certain religion, or even whether it is body-shaming people. But as I say, this doesn't necessarily have a proper philosophical grounding to any of it, and it basically just relies on the force of the state to impose these values, which seem to be pretty arbitrary. It doesn't seem that there are any metaphysical values to which this is aiming, other than the fact that they're trying to achieve a sense of equality for individuals in an atomistic sense, and also to deconstruct any kind of consensus opinion that might form among any kind of majority grouping. So it's a sort of minoritarian privileging framework. Okay, so that's the framework by which language is kind of policed, basically, even at a political level, in Western countries. Even though it doesn't seem to have a philosophical framework, it nevertheless has the backing of the state. But within a Christian polity, how and on what basis could language be policed? Now, I have myself put together a system of discourse analysis based on the work of a very famous and notable conservative, Richard Weaver, who was attempting to do exactly what I am, which is to find a way of analysing the rhetoric that people use, that is their public discourse, what they say publicly, in order to identify when they are being unethical or counter to achieving the common good for the body politic. So when they are doing things which detract from the good, the beautiful and the true. And also I'm drawing from a mentor of mine, who I think is one of the greatest thinkers of our time in terms of legal scholarship and jurisprudence, who is Frank van Dun, who I also consider my friend. Now, I know, okay, these two things, rhetoric, dialectic, you may not have even heard of those things. It might seem a little bit complicated. I promise this is actually really very simple. Rhetoric is the language that we use when we're speaking about things publicly. Dialectic is the language that we use for more formal, private things, particularly argumentation. So think about, for instance, in jurisprudence, so in a court of law, or think about an academic debate over a particular subject. So it's like our formal, private argument over something. Now, Aristotle basically said that these two are counterparts of each other. Others have said that they are like sisters. These are two sisters, and there's a third sister, the older sister, which is the logos of a society. Now, obviously, within a Christian polity, there's no debate there. It's defined, it's baked in that the logos is Christ, and it's the Word of God, and the Christian tradition, and the understanding of things. So, with our rhetoric, Richard Weaver outlined. And there's a lot of philosophical rigour that goes into this. I need to do a whole video just for this, but basically this is not just like off the top of his head. There's a lot of thought that goes into this philosophically. But there are 4 criteria where we might be able to analyse whether a speaker is being suspicious and may have some unethical, let's say, intention behind what they're saying and doing there. For Richard Weaver, it's very important to understand that we've all been enculturated, we've all grown up within a culture, and there is a history behind what we're doing. And so even in our supposedly skepticist, naturalistic, liberal society, where they say, oh, I don't really believe in truth or anything like that, well, when they're speaking publicly and they're making statements, they're espousing, they will be espousing their ideas as they're speaking. And so, you can't just say, well, I have no ideas and I have no truth and I'm not intending to do anything with my words there. You are necessarily influencing people by what you're saying. And so there's kind of a fifth point here in terms of people's rhetoric, which is that even pseudo-neutrality, where you say like, oh, I don't really have a position, I've got no skin in the game here at all, in what you're saying, well, potentially you do. And so even like a pseudo-neutrality has to be treated with suspicion. But, we've got things like false names and definitions. Especially you've got to watch out, if people start to use sophistry or semantics, I should say, and sort of altering the meaning of words with what they say. Or number two, we've got distorted cause and effect reasoning. We see that sort of thing all the time, where perhaps a minority group is not doing so well, maybe economically, in a particular country, and so it's then blamed on the hatred or the bigotry of a majority group within the country. Of course, three false analogies. The simplest and most obvious and most common of these is where anyone trying to adhere to some kind of objective value or approaching the natural order in any way is then labelled Hitler or something like that. They're called literally Hitler or something like that. And number four, arguments from authority. So these could even be arguments which are very, very idealistic, but not actually then applied to anything actual, not actually brought into reality. So utopian arguments, for instance, or it could even be someone just saying, well, Gandhi said da 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 da, and then it's just automatically assumed to then be good, because that person is automatically assumed to be good. Well, that's not necessarily the case, and not necessarily so for every group. Okay, so that's the rhetoric side of things, and its complementary sister side of things, the dialectic. Now, the work of Frank van Daan here was basically to identify what are the four causes of private conflicts that occur between individuals or between groups within a polity. Those sources of conflict were considered to be plurality, diversity, scarcity of goods, and free access of goods. So what are the solutions for these things? Okay, well, unity. So that means the creation of societies which have shared goals, certainly like civic projects and things like that. And we've spoken a little bit about that already, about the duties of a government within a polity to create a level of subsidiarity and duties for individuals, and even allowing the creation of various organic groups which have shared goals. Consensus, so these are groups which have shared loves and shared values within the society, obviously then contributing to the creation of unity. And so where you have a consensus, you have shared definitions of virtues like justice, and you have shared love. So within a family, for instance, there's the shared love there, and there's that shared aim for the good of the family. And you might think within a nation, let's say like Japan, where there's a shared love of what it means to be Japanese. And you might think of countries where you have a shared, a dominant religion within the country, and where there's homogeneity of the people ethnically within the country, or there's a shared love of their people, and there's a shared love of the traditions and the religion, because it provides one with a sense of home, and it provides one with a sense of belonging, and something to which they can be loyal, and they can sacrifice their loyalty, knowing that everyone else within that society, within that polity, feels the same and does the same, has the same shared love, and is prepared to also make a sacrifice. Number 3, abundance. Look at, for instance, a country like China, where they have a certain sense of autarky in their economy. So they make sure that their own country doesn't just outsource everything, but their own country can provide for its own needs. So in an emergency, in a time of war or something like that, they know that they can survive and they can provide for what their country needs and for their own people. There are not infinite resources, and there's always going to be a scarcity of goods. Even if we were to go to the Garden of Eden, you might want to stand in a particular spot, and I might want to stand there. We can't both share that spot, so arguably there could potentially be some kind of conflict there. But what we can do is, in principle, for the common good of the whole, is to make sure the body has what it needs. Then all the parts of the body will also remain healthy, even in the most severe of times. And number 4, of course, rather than everyone having free access to everything and there being chaos, having a sense of property, so like private property or personal property, properly designates who has ownership of certain things, and it prevents conflict in that sense. As well as markets, having markets for things as well, rather than eliminating that, like in a communist system, and then not really being able to determine pricing for things. Having a sense of property and having markets is the natural order in human affairs of dealing with that issue. Okay, so how does this then work practically? Okay, we've got this rhetoric and we've got these criteria for analysing when people print something or say something publicly or whatever. And we've also got this dialectic, so we've got these 4 principles which need to be upheld in order to eliminate conflict between private groups or individuals, or even to preempt them. Well, we can take this as the dialectic. Those principles need to be adhered to. The legislature within a polity needs to work on those principles and on the Christian grounding on which those principles stand. So when a law, for instance, needs to be vetoed by the executive, or when a law is going to be created by the legislature, or a decision is going to be made by a judge, if that is how your system works, as is the case in the Anglo common law system, then it's on these principles that intentions and decisions need to be assessed. And our rhetorical tools here, these criteria, are able to help us assess whether an actor is indeed a bad actor, acting in his self-interest to the detriment of the group and the common good of the body politic. And what I found most interesting developing this here is that discourse analysis, analysing language, really this was developed by the right, and it was developed by Christians, conservatives and reactionary types, who said we need to have some kind of foundation for our language and the political responsibility that it carries. To conclude then, in this video, we've provided a system, a framework of discourse analysis, which then enables us to defend the spiritual security of a Christian polity, so that we have a rigorous framework in order to assess the memes produced by the innovators of ideas and the thought leaders of a Christian polity. You might ask, however, well, haven't you said in previous videos that the rise of technology, its almost inevitable rise, especially the technology of money, leads inevitably to the collapse of civilizations? Seeing as money talks, and it seems that everything, everywhere now, including our public discourse, is enslaved to this system of mammon. How then can we go from our totally hyper-individualistic age to arrive at some totally hypothetical, perhaps even idealistic Christian polity? And so that will be the subject of my next video. The rise of technology and how a philanthropic polity, which harnesses that technology, putting the tools back into the hands of man, might arise. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, please click like and obviously subscribe. Until next time, God bless you.